In the winter of 1886, deep in the Dakota Territory, a cold came down from the northern plains that men who had lived their whole lives on the frontier said they had never felt before. It arrived not all at once, but in stages, like something patient and deliberate. First the wind, then the silence, then a stillness in the air that made even the oxen uneasy in their stalls. The sky took on a particular shade of white that the older settlers recognized without being able to explain, and the wolves, usually bold that time of year, stopped coming near the homesteads altogether. Those who paid attention to such things understood that what was coming was not an ordinary winter. They were right. But long before the worst of it arrived, a man named George Allen was already being laughed at. He had settled near the town of Vermilion, not far from the Missouri River, in what was then the southeastern edge of the territory, sometime in the spring of 1883. His nearest neighbors, the Hargrove family, lived about a half-day's walk to the east, and the Lund brothers, Silas and Clarence, had their homestead nearly a full day's ride to the north. The land around George Allen's claim was rolling and open, cut through by shallow draws and stands of cottonwood that marked where water ran in the wet months. It was good country in summer. In winter, it was something else entirely. George Allen had not come to the Dakota Territory by the usual roads. He had served 4 years in the Union Army during the war, fighting with the 16th Iowa Infantry through some of the harder country along the Mississippi campaigns. After the war, he had spent a number of years drifting west by degrees, first to Missouri, then Kansas, then Nebraska, working cattle drives and doing whatever work came available. He was not a young man by the time he filed his claim. He was somewhere past 40, lean and deliberate in the way men become when they have spent too many years moving and finally found a place they intend to stay. He had a wife named Clara and 2 children, a boy of 12 named Thomas and a girl of 8 named Ruth. They had come west together in a wagon that had seen better days, with a mule named General that had seen even worse. What made George Allen different from most men who homesteaded in the Dakota Territory in those years was not his military background, and it was not any particular cleverness. It was something he had seen. During a period when he had worked briefly as a teamster hauling goods through the northern plains of Wyoming, he had spent several weeks near a Cheyenne winter camp in a sheltered valley near the base of the Big Horn Mountains. He had observed, not with any scientific intention, simply out of curiosity and proximity, how those families constructed their winter shelters, not the summer teepees which most travelers recognized, something different. Something that used the earth itself as part of the structure. He had watched them work, and he had felt the warmth inside those structures when the temperature outside was enough to crack wood, and he had filed the observation away in the back of his mind, the way a practical man does with something he doesn't yet have a use for. By the time he reached the Dakota Territory and began to understand what winters there truly meant, the memory of that Cheyenne winter camp came back to him with a new urgency. The problem that every homesteader in that region faced was the same problem that had faced every person who tried to live on the open northern plains since time beyond memory: the cold. Not cold the way people who had lived in Iowa or Ohio understood cold. This was a different category of experience. The wind came across hundreds of miles of flat, open ground with nothing to slow it, and it struck wooden structures with a persistence that was almost personal. The standard homesteader cabin of the period, notched logs or sod depending on what was available, with a fireplace or iron stove and whatever chinking could be managed, was adequate through much of the autumn and into early winter. But when the real cold came, when the temperature dropped past anything a man could estimate with a thermometer he owned, those structures revealed their limits. The fire that kept a family tolerably warm in November was barely enough to keep them from frostbite in January. The wood that lasted a week in October was gone in 3 days in February. People burned furniture. People burned floorboards. People who ran out of fuel before the cold broke had died because of it, and this was not a thing that happened in stories. It was a thing that had happened to families that other families knew. George Allen had spent 2 winters in his standard log cabin before he began to act on what he had seen in Wyoming. Both winters had been survivable, but they had been genuinely frightening in ways he did not discuss with his neighbors. He had watched his family burn through a supply of wood he had spent most of the summer cutting, and he had felt what it meant when the temperature inside the cabin, even with a good fire going, was still cold enough to see his breath when he lay in his bed at night. He had pressed his hand against the log wall in January and felt the cold radiating through the wood, as though the wall itself was not a barrier but a conductor. And he had thought about what he had seen in that Cheyenne winter camp in Wyoming, where the earth had been used not just as a floor, but as walls, as insulation, as something that held warmth the way a stone holds the heat of an afternoon sun long into the evening. He spent most of the summer of 1885 planning. He talked to Silas Lund about his idea when Silas came through on his way to Vermilion for supplies. Silas listened with the particular patience of a man who thinks another man has lost his sense. And when George had finished explaining, Silas said that digging a house into the ground sounded like a fine way to drown yourself in the spring thaw, and also that if God had wanted people to live underground, he wouldn't have given them the lumber trade. George's wife, Clara, had questions that were more practical and no less skeptical. She had grown up in a proper house in Dubuque and had already made her peace with the log cabin. The idea of living partially in the earth struck her as a step in the wrong direction, and she said so plainly. Thomas, who was 13 by that summer, found the whole idea embarrassing in the way that boys of that age find most things their fathers do embarrassing. Only Ruth, who was 9 and primarily interested in whether General the Mule would be allowed inside, reserved judgment. When George told Harlan Greer, who had a homestead about 2 miles south and was considered by the surrounding community to be the man who knew most about practical building, about his plan, Harlan stared at him for a long moment and then said, "George, I have known you for near on 3 years, and I have never thought you were a fool, but I am reconsidering." The laughter was not cruel exactly. It was the laughter of people who had survived difficulty through methods that had been tested and who regarded untested methods with the suspicion they deserved. On the frontier, the cost of a failed experiment was not a wasted afternoon. It could be a wasted life. George understood their skepticism. He shared it to a degree. But he could not shake the memory of what he had felt inside that Cheyenne shelter when the Wyoming wind was screaming outside and the interior was warm enough to sit without a coat. He had made his decision. He would build the thing. He began in earnest in late July of 1885, when the ground was warm and the days were long, and he had no excuse to delay further. The site he chose was a natural rise in the land about 100 yards behind his existing cabin, where a low hillside offered something to work with. He had watched in Wyoming how the Cheyenne had selected similar sites, not just any flat ground, but places where the earth itself could become part of the structure, where the slope of the land did half the excavation work before a shovel touched the soil. He spent several days walking the rise from different angles before he put the first mark in the ground. The digging was the work of weeks. George did it himself for the most part, with Thomas helping when the boys' school lessons and regular chores allowed. The design he had settled on was a structure that would sit mostly into the hillside, with the front face and entrance pointing roughly south to catch what winter sun there was. The walls on 3 sides would be the earth itself, packed soil and clay that he would reinforce with timber framing to prevent collapse, then layer against with sod on the outside. The roof would be timber, heavily built and angled, then covered with a thickness of sod and earth that would, by the time he was finished, be deep enough that a man walking across the top would not easily distinguish it from the hillside around it. The front wall would be log, with a proper door and 2 small windows placed low and facing south. He had no engineering training. He had no written plans. What he had was the memory of what he had observed, supplemented by the logic of a man who had spent decades solving practical problems with available materials. The Earth, as he understood it from what he had seen, and from his own experience in root cellars and dugout river crossings during the war, did something that wood and stone alone could not do as well on their own. It held temperature. Not like a fire holds temperature, generating heat outward, more like a coat holds temperature, keeping what is already there from escaping. The thickness of earth surrounding three sides and the roof of his structure would, he believed, act the way good winter clothing acts on a person, not creating warmth, but preventing the cold from reaching what was inside. He explained this to Harlan Greer one afternoon, when Harlan came by to observe the progress of what he had started calling Allen's hole in the ground. George described it the way he would describe why a root cellar stays usable through winter. The earth around it doesn't change temperature the way air does. Harlan acknowledged that root cellars worked, and George said that was exactly his point, and Harlan replied that a root cellar was for potatoes, not families, and rode away, shaking his head. Silas Lund came by twice during the construction, and each time left with a new piece of skeptical commentary. The second time, he brought his brother Clarence, who had opinions about structural integrity that were not encouraging. Clara watched the work progress with what George could only describe as cautious silence, which was its own kind of communication. The timber work occupied most of August and into September. George used cottonwood for much of it, supplemented by some heavier elm he had managed to haul from a stand about 2 hours to the east, floating the larger pieces down a draw during a wet week when the water was running. The framing had to be substantial. It would carry the weight of the earth and sod above, which was considerable once rain or snow added to it. He pegged and notched the joints the way he had learned to work wood during his years of frontier construction, checking each connection with his hands as much as his eyes, feeling for any flex or give that shouldn't be there. He reinforced the corners with angle bracing that added time to the work, but which he felt was worth the security. The sod cutting came next, and it was the most physically demanding part of the entire project. He cut the sod in blocks about the thickness of a man's forearm and roughly the span of 2 hands across, using a sharpened iron blade fitted to a wooden handle he had made for the purpose. Clara joined him for this work, moving the cut blocks to a low stone boat he had rigged behind General, and the mule, who did not enjoy any of this, hauled each load to the building site. Thomas stacked and fitted the blocks with a care George had not expected from the boy, and when he asked Thomas about it, the boy shrugged and said he didn't want the thing to fall in while they were sleeping. It was a reasonable position. By the middle of October, with the first frosts already whitening the grass each morning, the structure was essentially complete. It sat in the hillside in a way that still struck most visitors as deeply peculiar, more of an intrusion into the landscape than a structure placed upon it. A door and 2 small windows set into a low face of notched logs, with nothing visible above but a rounded mound of earth and dying grass that blended with the hillside around it. Harlan Greer came by the day George moved the family's bedding and most of their furniture inside, stood for a while with his hands in his coat pockets, looked at the doorway, looked at the hillside above it, and said, "I hope you know what you're doing, George." George said he supposed he would find out. The first days inside were an adjustment. The light was different. The 2 south-facing windows let in sun, but the space was necessarily dimmer than the log cabin. The ceiling was lower than the family was accustomed to. Clara hung some of their few extra pieces of cloth to soften the wall surfaces where raw timber showed, and this helped. But what was immediately noticeable, even in October when the temperature had not yet reached its worst, was that the interior held a steadiness of temperature that the log cabin had never managed. In the cabin, the warmth gathered near the stove and faded toward the walls and corners. In the earth shelter, the air was simply even, not dramatically warm, not a luxury, but even in a way that the body recognized as different without quite being able to articulate why. George burned a fraction of the wood in October compared to what the log cabin had required the previous October. He noted this in the way a practical man notes something, by observation, by the pile of wood that was staying larger than expected, by the number of times he found he did not need to stoke the fire in the middle of the night. Clara noted it by the way the morning temperature inside was not the ordeal it had been in the cabin. The difference between waking to air that was cold but not brutal and waking to air that made you dread putting your feet on the floor. He tried again to explain the logic to Silas Lund when Silas stopped by in early November. He said it was like the difference between wearing one shirt in winter and wearing several layers. The same amount of warmth was being put in, but the layers kept it from leaving so quickly. Silas said that was different because a coat was moving with you and the earth wasn't, and George said that was true, but that the principle of keeping what warmth you had from escaping was the same either way. Silas said he would take his regular cabin, thank you, which he had built in 1880, and which had served him fine for 5 winters. George said he hoped it would continue to serve him. The skies through November told a story that the experienced settlers read with varying degrees of anxiety. The geese had moved south earlier than usual, and in larger numbers, moving in formations that seemed almost hurried against the pale sky. The old-timer who kept a trading post in Vermilion, a man named Josiah Pratt, who had been on the plains since before the war, told anyone who asked that the signs were worse than he had seen in 30 years. He pointed to the thickness of the fur on the rabbits he trapped, which was notably heavier than most years. He pointed to the way the cattle had begun pressing together in the south corners of every pasture days before any visible change in the weather. He said the animals knew something, and that what they knew was that what was coming was serious. The Lund brothers began cutting extra wood the second week of November. Harlan Greer hauled an additional wagon load of split timber from a stand 5 miles east and stacked it against his cabin wall until the stack rose nearly to the eave. Families throughout the area who had livestock made arrangements to shelter as many animals as possible inside or in adjoining structures, because livestock that froze was not just a loss. It was a catastrophe that could unmake a homestead's entire year of work in a single night. George Allen, watching his neighbor's preparations, felt the particular discomfort of not being certain his own unconventional shelter would hold against whatever was coming. He had faith in his reasoning. He was less certain about his execution. The cold began to intensify in earnest around the 3rd week of November. Not all at once. That was what struck observers as unusual about the way it arrived. Most severe cold on the plains came with a specific event, a blizzard, a wind shift, a sudden drop that everyone experienced together and could mark on a calendar. This cold crept. The temperature fell a little each day, and then a little more, and then more than that, and the sky each morning was the same flat white grey, and the wind came from the northwest with a consistency that stopped feeling like weather and started feeling like a permanent condition of existence. By the 1st week of December, the ground was frozen to a depth that made even shallow digging impossible. By the middle of December, the Missouri River at Vermilion was locked solid enough to drive a wagon across, which men did out of necessity and something close to disbelief at the scale of the freezing. Inside the earth shelter, George Allen's family continued to function. This was the word that came to Clara later when she tried to describe those weeks to her sister in Dubuque. They functioned. The stove burned, but at a pace that seemed almost leisurely compared to what the log cabin had demanded. The interior of the shelter, even when the temperature outside had dropped to something she could not measure with her thermometer, the mercury had retreated below the scale, marked on the glass, held a warmth that was not comfortable in the summer sense of the word, but was survivable in a deep and bone-level way. The walls, 3 feet of packed earth on 3 sides, and a roof of soil and sod above, did not conduct the cold inward the way the wooden walls of the cabin had. The earth had its own temperature, something that ran deeper than the weather above it, and it worked the way George had described, like a coat, holding the interior against the assault outside rather than joining the assault. Thomas and Ruth slept without suffering in ways that had not been possible the previous 2 winters. The water in the bucket near the door developed a rim of ice each night, but it did not freeze solid. The bread Clara baked held its warmth longer than it ever had in the cabin. Small things, daily things, the evidence of a theory made real. Silas Lund appeared at the door of the earth shelter on a morning in the 2nd week of December that George would later describe as the worst single day of that winter. Not because of any single event, but because of the accumulated weight of it, the wind and the cold and the low sky pressing everything flat. Silas had ridden from his homestead to the north, which meant he had been exposed to that wind for a full day's travel. And when he came through the door, his face was a color that was alarming. He stood in the entrance for a moment without speaking, and then he said, "Lord above, George." He said it quietly, the way a man speaks when he has just encountered something he was not prepared for. The warmth of the earth shelter, not dramatic, not the blast of heat from a roaring fire, but the simple, steady, solid warmth of a space that had been holding its temperature through weeks of assault, reached him as something almost physical. He had been unable to keep his own cabin adequately warm for 3 days. He had burned through his extra wood. His wife Margaret and their youngest child had spent the previous 2 nights in their bed, wearing every piece of clothing they owned. He did not say he had been wrong. Silas Lund was not a man who said such things easily, and George Allen was not a man who needed to hear it. But Silas sat by the small stove in the earth shelter for close to 2 hours, drinking coffee that Clara brought him. And the color came back into his face by degrees, and when he finally spoke again, he asked George to explain, as simply as he could manage, how the structure worked and what had gone into building it. George explained it the way he had tried to explain it before, but this time Silas listened differently, with the attention of a man who is no longer evaluating whether something is believable and has moved on to understanding how it works. Clarence Lund came the following day. Then Harlan Greer came, bringing his eldest son. What Harlan said when he stepped inside was that he owed George an apology, and he offered it plainly and without qualification, and George accepted it the same way. What Harlan noticed first was not the warmth itself, but the absence of the particular misery he had been living with for weeks. The way the cold in his own cabin had required constant active management, constant attention to the fire, constant monitoring of the family's physical state. In the earth shelter there was nothing to manage. The structure was managing it. This was, as Harlan said, a different kind of thing entirely. The cold that winter was remembered throughout the Dakota Territory for years. It reached levels that broke whatever informal records the settlers kept, and it lasted longer than any cold spell in living memory of the white settlers who had been there longest. Families who were adequately prepared survived it with difficulty. Families who were not adequately prepared faced losses of livestock, property, and in some cases worse. The winter of 1886 into 1887 was the winter that ended many homesteaders' hopes and sent them back east, and it was also the winter that transformed George Allen's strange hole in the hillside from a laughingstock into something people made notes about. By the spring of 1887, Silas and Clarence Lund were planning their own earth shelter for the following autumn. With George's help, and with modifications based on what they had observed and what Silas had felt during that long December afternoon inside the Allen structure, Harlan Greer broke ground on his own version in June, with his eldest son doing much of the digging. 2 other families in the broader area around Vermilion began similar constructions that year, having heard the account of the winter at second hand and, unlike the previous audience for this story, now having the events of the winter as evidence that could not be easily dismissed. George Allen's earth shelter stood for a long time after that winter. It served his family through the rest of the years they remained on that claim, through winters that were severe and winters that were mild, and it held against all of them with the same quiet reliability it had demonstrated in those worst weeks of 1886. Clara, who had been the most privately skeptical of the project from the beginning, became its most straightforward advocate, with visitors and correspondence, describing in her letters the practical differences in daily life that the structure made. The wood that lasted, the mornings that were bearable, the sleep that was untroubled by cold in a way that the cabin had never managed. Thomas, who had been embarrassed by his father's unconventional project at 13, helped build his own earth-sheltered structure on his first homestead claim years later, without needing to be persuaded. The structure itself, long after the Allens had moved on from the claim, George was past 60 by the time they finally sold the land and went to live near Thomas's family, remained part of that hillside in a way that the log cabin they had originally built did not. The cabin eventually fell. The earth shelter became part of the hill, and later homesteaders who came to that land found it still usable, still holding temperature, still doing quietly and without drama what it had been designed to do. The knowledge that built it had traveled further by then, passed through conversations and observations and the practical logic of people who had seen it work and understood why. There is something in that story that runs deeper than the particular design of a structure or the particular winter that tested it. George Allen had not invented a theory. He had observed something, watched it with his own eyes during a brief and unremarkable period of his life, and he had been willing to act on that observation when acting on it meant standing against the consensus of every experienced person around him. The men who laughed at him were not fools. They were practical people drawing on tested knowledge, which is exactly what practical people are supposed to do. What George had, that they did not in that particular moment, was the memory of a different solution to the same problem. A solution developed by people who had lived on those plains through conditions far worse than any white settler had yet experienced, and who had worked out over generations what the earth itself could do in service of survival. He had seen it. He had believed what he saw. He had done the difficult and lonely and occasionally humiliating work of building it while everyone around him predicted failure. And then the winter had come, and the structure had done what he had believed it would do, and the knowing of that had spread outward through a community in the particular way that demonstrated truth always spreads, not through argument, but through experience. There are thousands of stories like this buried in the history of the American frontier, stories of men and women who saw something others had not yet seen, or remembered something others had forgotten, and who held on to that knowledge through difficulty and skepticism until the moment arrived that showed it to be true. These stories rarely made it into newspapers. They circulated between neighbors, recorded in letters that ended up in boxes in attics, found now and then by descendants who know the name but not always the details of what that ancestor built or survived. They are stories of ingenuity that was not glamorous, of thinking that was not celebrated until it worked, of persistence that had no audience except the people who needed it most. If these accounts matter to you, if you find value in remembering the human ways that ordinary people solved extraordinary problems with what they had and what they observed, then the work of keeping these stories alive depends on people who share that belief. Every account saved from forgetting is an act of respect for those lives. This channel exists because there is a community of people who believe these stories deserve to be told, and told in ways that honor the reality behind them. If you are one of those people, subscribe if you haven't. Share this with someone who would feel it the way you do. And tell us in the comments what your own people remembered. Those accounts are part of this history too. George Allen built his shelter because he had seen something true, and he had trusted what he saw. That is, in the end, as old a story as human survival itself, and as worth remembering.